set out on a series of cultural revolutions that brought chaos to the country, made hundreds of millions of people miserable, and made the country worse off when he died, 30 years later than when he came to power, and killed some 70 million people in the process. In the meantime, his arch-rival, Chiang Kai-shek, who fled to Taiwan, set up a capitalist regime which, once it was rich enough, converted itself into a democracy in the 1980s, as is now happening all over the world. There are no rich dictatorships. Dictatorships are for poor countries. Hence, if Mao had lost to Chiang, China would probably be far richer now, and possibly even a democracy. It might have been a big Japan. The world would have been very different from what it is at the time of writing. Today's CCP is still a one-party state, anxious to hold on to power. This becomes increasingly difficult for many reasons, which will be mentioned briefly here. The original ideology that brought the communists to power was Marxist. Mao and others were strongly influenced by Marx's ideas on the exploitative evils of early capitalism, that is, the exploitation by the capitalist factory and machine owners of the excess labour of their employee labourers, who earned the value of their wages by working X hours a day, but then worked for a further Y hours a day for the capitalists, who pocketed the profits of that excess labour value, or as Marx called it, surplus labour value. This Marxist economic abstraction translated easily into the practical reality of landlord exploitation of the labour of the peasant, where the landlord would often take as much as 75% of the crop that the peasant farmers would labour for and harvest. This anti-exploitation logic made a lot of sense to a lot of people in early 20th century China. They were motivated to modernize China, free it from colonial exploitation by foreigners, to promote a sense of pride in the country again, and to make it democratic. As you can imagine, a lot of Chinese thinkers went along with these ideals, but once Mao came to power, he implemented some of them. That is, for example, he got rid of the exploiting landlords, he expelled the foreigners, and he tried to make China modern. Unfortunately, he could not resist becoming a new emperor himself, and forgot about his promises of creating a democratic China. In practice, he became the worst dictator in history, killing more than any other great tyrant of the 20th century. After 30 years of Maoist chaos, the new pragmatic Deng Xiaoping, who had been purged several times by Mao, was fed up. As soon as Mao died, Deng pushed Mao's wife and her cronies, the Gang of Four, out of power. He then reversed Chinese economic policy by restoring capitalism. The result was an explosion of economic growth, the greatest the world has ever known. It's largely because of this growth that I've chosen to come to China. I want to participate in China's rise to dominance, and as a consequence, and over time, see it lead the world intellectually on what humanity should do with the species dominance question. But that's another issue, and not the topic of this book. See my first book, The Artellect War, Cosmos versus Terrans, a bitter controversy concerning whether humanity should build godlike, massively intelligent machines, if you'd like to know more about this issue. But the original ideology that brought Mao to power, that is Marxism, has gone. Deng realized, and so did the rest of the world, based on the experience of many countries, that communist economics doesn't work. The basic idea that everyone should work for the good of everyone did not tap into the motivating force to work hard for one's own profit and gain. Adam Smith, the great British classical economist, was a better psychologist than Karl Marx. Smith spoke about the invisible hand. That is the idea that when people work for their own personal profit, they are motivated to work hard. They create companies which compete with each other for sales, and that forces prices down and efficiency up, which ultimately benefits everyone. As the Americans put it, all boats rise. That is, the rising tide of economic efficiency increases everyone's living standard. After decades of communist economics, comparative economists looked at the results. For example, they compared China with Japan, or East Germany with West Germany, or North and South Korea. The verdict was obvious. Communist economics did not work. The Russian people got fed up waiting for hours for a loaf of bread, and eventually threw out their communist leaders. So if the original communist ideology is no longer accepted in China, then why is an old communist regime still in power? This question has a lot of weight. The current Chinese regime is incredibly corrupt. China is so politically, economically and socially backward by Western standards that it does not even have a rule of law. See the last section below on this. There are no real constraints on corrupt political bosses and administrators to stop them from milking off money from the state-run companies and organizations. The general Chinese public think that most CCP members are corrupt and at all levels. Even the CCP high-level politicians recognize that if the corruption becomes bad enough, and it is already very bad in China, that the general public may want the CCP to be overthrown and replaced by a democracy for that reason alone. When one is the victim of corruption, one is disgusted and seeks revenge. One wants to go to the courts and sue the evildoers. But in China, such institutions barely exist. There are far fewer lawyers, and especially criminal lawyers in China, in proportion to population size, than there are in Western countries. If one tries to sue some corrupt CCP official, then all too likely the official will hear about it and abuse his power to protect himself, or even worse, hire some thugs to beat up the troublemaker, or worse still, have the troublemaker killed. The judiciary, that is the courts and the judges, are a part of the CCP. That is, they are under CCP control, not independent. They are a part of the problem. So there's no effective escape valve for ordinary Chinese citizens to sue the corrupt officials. Actually, there is some. The CCP has made some concession to the growing frustrations of the Chinese people, so they do provide some legal escape valve, but it's not enough, and of course it cannot be enough, because if it were, the whole CCP would be made illegal. As business people become more powerful, they wish to be free of corrupt officials. For example, and this is only a small case, a friend of my Chinese wife has a small retail business selling light fittings, etc. She complains of having to wine and dine corrupt local officials so that they will not make life difficult for her by imposing petty bylaws that block her business. If such things happen in the West, then the business friend could simply go to a lawyer or to the local council and complain. If the city council did nothing, which would be unlikely, then the business friend could go to the local paper and kick up a stink that the mayor of the city allows such corrupt practices to continue. The mayor would then face a torrent of negative publicity and would then probably lose the next elections. Thus the existence of an independent judiciary, that is, independent of politicians, the existence of a free, muckraking press, and a democratically elected mayor and higher officials, all the way to the top, that is, presidents and prime ministers of countries, make such massive scale corruption virtually impossible in democratic countries. Of course, corruption still goes on, but it's usually far more hidden, more subtle, because the corruptors know they have the cards stacked against them in democratic countries. But the cards are stacked in favour of corruptors in China. Corruption is one of the biggest sources of resentment and anger against the CCP, and the lack of democracy that, if it existed in China, would quickly kill mass corruption. So to thinking educated people who are conscious of the level of corruption in China, the need for democratic reforms is obvious. Unfortunately, only a small proportion of the Chinese public is well educated and conscious enough to know that so much of China's corruption problem is due to a lack of the basic institutions of democracy that any high school student would know about in the West. The CCP deliberately makes it difficult for the Chinese public to become educated into the basic concepts of democracy. For example, A. Free periodic multi-party elections to choose the leaders, forcing them to do a good job and to please the majority of the voters. Otherwise, they are replaced at the next election by an opposition party, which is always hungry to get into power. This is the basic notion of Rousseau's social contract. That is, that the people make a contract with the leaders that they are to serve the people, not vice versa. If the leaders do a bad job, the contract is broken and a new set of leaders is selected, that is, voted in by the people. B. An independent judiciary so that legal disputes can be resolved without the collusion of politicians. C. A free press to muckrake scandals and corruption by politicians and officials. D. The right to form trade unions so that employers cannot exploit their employees by making excessive profits. E. The right to free speech so that people can feel free to complain about things they feel oppress them or to disagree with current ideas or ideologies pushed by the politicians, etc. F. The right of assembly, that is, the right to form organizations to contest political power or to lobby those in power or to protest against those in power. G. freedom of religion. That is, one is free to believe whatever religion one wants and not be persecuted because of a particular belief. H, etc. China and several dozen other third world nations do not have these basic democratic institutions. These countries are still politically underdeveloped and their populations suffer correspondingly. Personally, I may live another 30 years in China. Ad-libbing? No way. A year or two, I'm out of here. I'm fed up. China's still a brutal dictatorship, still a political shithole. I'm fed up. Back to the book. I expect to see the China go democratic during the first half of that period, and I expect to see a new modern China emerge from that transition in the second half. I then anticipate an explosion of Chinese creativity as over 1 billion people become energized by the new China, with a new pride in their new dominant place in the world. Once China fully taps into its enormous potential, its intelligence, its incredible energy, its large population, its raw materials, and its rich cultural history, it will change not only itself, but the whole world. The 21st century will be China's. Ad-libbing, I still feel that that's true, but the timing is wrong. I'm just here too soon, maybe a decade, 2 decades too soon. And I'm getting too old. I'm now 70. I recently had a 70th birthday, so the timing is fucked up. Back to the book. But China has to get through the next decade or two to make that transition, and I hope it can be done smoothly. In Chapter 2, I laid out a basic plan as to how the CCP could reform itself. Actually, I consider that the a priori odds that China's transition to democracy will be smooth are quite good. This opinion is based on empirical observations taken from the branch of political science called transitology, which studies how countries switch from dictatorial regimes to democratic regimes. It has noted that in the last few decades, in the so-called third wave of global democratization, in which southern and eastern Europe went democratic, so too with Russia and many Asian countries, that in about 3/4 of these cases, the transition itself did not come from people power. That is, it was not the case that the people overthrew the regime in an act of mass collective defiance of the regime, but rather that a democratically minded faction inside the dictatorial regime grabbed power and led the country into becoming a democratic state. The fact that this is by far the most common route to democracy augurs well for China. Perhaps some not-so-young Chinese Gorbachev is waiting for his moment in the hierarchy of the CCP to lead China into democracy by reforming the CCP into a new democratic entity with a new name, a new doctrine, but with many of the same human players, many of whom may be very happy to be part of a modern democratic China. That is a China they can finally be proud of and not ashamed of, because it will lose its backwardness, its corruption, its dishonesty and poverty. With the rise of the internet, and especially broadband internet, it's inevitable that hundreds of millions of Chinese will be exposed to ideas from the West. In practice, they will be largely intellectually colonized by them, for the simple reason that Chinese intellectual, scientific, technical culture is highly underdeveloped at the time of writing. There are far too few highly educated intellectuals in China, and they are not free to say what they think. At the time of writing, most of the world's new ideas come from the West. So until China becomes a highly developed country with freedom of speech and with large numbers of well-educated and articulate intellectuals, it's inevitable that when China does open itself up fully to the broadband internet of the world, its intellectuals will be largely westernized, at least at first. China has such a long way to catch up with the West in all fields, especially in politics. As millions of Chinese business people and Chinese tourists travel to other countries and see how much richer they are, how much freer, how much more politically developed, how much more generous and happier they are, then they will feel ashamed of China and be motivated to see China modernize, that is, become a democracy, so that China can achieve its full potential. A similar story holds for Chinese overseas students. China sends its brightest students to the West, largely to the US and to Europe, who in 2/3 of cases return to China, having been westernized to a large extent. There are hundreds of thousands of such students, probably including the future leaders of China. Since these students are China's brightest, they will have a powerful influence on China's future. Since many of them will feel ashamed of China's current inferiorities, many of them will be keen to modernize China by helping to make it democratic. China exists in a world that is becoming ever more democratic. China has many neighboring or near neighboring countries that are already democratic. If China is slow at democratizing, then sooner or later all its neighbors will be democratic states. This international pressure on China will help push it to become a democracy. The most powerful force, it seems, in causing a dictatorial state to become a democracy is the rise of the middle class. There are already some 100 million middle-class people in China. I think of figures now somewhere between 200 and 300 million. So, about a fifth. They will increasingly have the internet and will demand a stronger say in the choice of who rules them. Being middle class, they will be far better educated than the traditional Chinese peasant farmer. They will be more intellectually critical and demand the right to vote incompetent or corrupt politicians out of office. They will argue that a monopoly company in a particular business area is bad for competitive service because there is no competition to keep the company on its toes. A monopoly company can afford to be lax and offer poor service to the public. Similarly with government, a dictatorship can afford to be lax in terms of settling the grievances of its population. Having a rival